Welcome to our webinar. It's about negotiation and conflict resolution. And conflict resolution is actually what we are working on in all our courses and formats that we offer. We are from the International Mediation Campus, and we have people from all over the world with us in these groups, and this is what makes it really special. And I think that's the same setting that we can see here, because our trainings, we have a fair price system in place, and that means that everybody pays according to the purchase power of their country where they are resident. And that leads to the fact that we have people from all over the world, no matter how the purchase power in their country is. And that gives, apart from learning and becoming an IMI, internationally certified mediator, really like enriching experience of communicating with people and building the network all over the world, and also see the cultural differences and of course personal differences. So also our trainers are coming from all over the world. Actually, Rebecca, who is our speaker here, is also one of the trainers in our IM campus. We also have other offers. As you can see here, we have free webinars. This is not the first free webinar, and it won't be the last free webinars that we have. If you want to participate on other webinars around conflict management, around mediation, around negotiation, then please enroll, and we're really happy to see you again. Rebecca, and we are so happy that you're here, and I'm looking forward to your teaching, to your class, to your presentation. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Andrea. And I can't speak highly enough about IM Campus and its programming. And it's great to see such a fantastic turnout today. Thank you all so much for being here. So as Andrea said, I am a former US diplomat with a science and engineering background. It's an interesting mix. And I spent the largest part of my career in the US Department of State working on United Nations affairs. And so the frame that I'm going to bring to negotiations today starts largely from that experience, from that 10 plus years representing the United States at the United Nations. That said, that frame is also gained largely in hindsight. When you're in the midst of situations of conflict, be they personal, policy, physical, otherwise, it's kind of hard to get perspective on things. And so the frame that I'm going to use is kind of about cooperation. And I think that the book that Andrea mentioned is a good example of that. So my two co-authors on that book are former colleagues with whom I used to negotiate at the United Nations. Some would say negotiate against. They're not from the United States. They're from Singapore and from Guatemala. But I would tell you that's exactly the wrong lens to look at it. We did not negotiate against each other. We worked together to negotiate outcomes. And that's sort of what I want to present to you today. And that's what we try to share with others through our teaching. So let me actually share my screen, which I should have already done. We'll get there now. So here we go. There aren't a lot of words on here, but I think it's a little bit more interesting for you to have some nice cartoons than to have to look at just me for 1 hour. So we'll put this up. So today I will talk to you about negotiation and conflict resolution. And so I really think that negotiation has or should have an outsized role in our current climate. And I'm talking broadly, very broadly across the world, right? We are all, no matter where we live, I see you all come from all around the world. We are all living in a changing, interconnected world where climate change and human impacts are altering the equations of our daily lives. I mean, we've seen this most poignantly, I think, with the COVID pandemic, right? Every individual and entity in society has an interest in these emerging challenges. And so we face collectively, right? As a collective, as a global population, ever more difficult policy debates and decisions at all levels. At the international level, sure, but also at the national level, the local level, the community level, and even at the family level. So how we deal with these increasing challenges with all these seeming conflicts of interest matters a lot. So we can talk about, as lots of politicians do, the many problems, the many possible solutions, but we also need to really institutionalize how to arrive at the right answers, how to develop the right policies, how to have the right responses, how to work together, come to agreements in a way that makes things stick. So I like to say, and I often argue, that at all levels, we as human beings need to start to look at things through a conflict resolution lens, right? That's what all of this is about. So of course, many of you as mediators, some of you are, I'm sure, mediation, the mediator is optimally facilitating an interest-based negotiation between the parties in conflict, right? And so this is a little bit more obvious to the participants when the conflict is evident and parties are willing to work together on a solution. In policy discussions, of course, you've seen this probably in your local, national, and even international governments. Multi-party negotiation over the interests at play on any policy issue, whether it's facilitated or mediated or not, even if it's just a conversation, is how to come to a good policy agreement, right? So a good policy conversation should be a negotiation, whether the participants realize it or not, because there are conflicting interests. So really, and as individuals, and I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this talk, we all negotiate things, big and small, all day long, right? Any little debate or difference of opinion is, or could be, or possibly should be a negotiation, a principled interest-based negotiation. So although most often I think about negotiation in the policy realm, what I'm going to talk to you about today applies to conflict in any realm, because I believe negotiation is always at play. Nearly all disputes, in my view, are best solved in an interest-based manner that feels fair and leaves all those who participated or who are impacted feeling, if not successful, then at least not cheated. So 2 points up front I want to make before I sort of dive into my 5 lessons that I want to share with you today. I'm focusing here today on the individual and on her actions and her behaviors, or his actions and his behaviors. But negotiation is really a group undertaking, and I don't want to lose sight of that. I am talking about individual behaviors, but it's about really the collective, be it 2 parties or more parties. There are just important individual roles and inputs here. And secondly, mediators, many of you, are optimally facilitating this kind of a dynamic when you are mediating. Okay, so how do we do this? How do we engage in effective negotiations in a group setting or one-on-one to come to a good agreement? How do we encourage participants or other parties in a mediation or in a conflict to do so? How do we negotiate, and how do we encourage others to engage in a negotiation? So that's what I would like to talk to you about today through just 5 keys. I've sort of simplified what I teach in negotiations into 5 key points that it's really important to remember for a successful negotiation. The first one is relationships. So in a standard negotiation, and I mentioned this up front in my introduction, in a standard negotiation, counterparts may feel like combatants, but this is a mistake. And it's a mistake that I made myself. In any discussion, in any negotiation, it is not a competition. It does not need to be a competition. Many people, out of fear, insecurity, or for a number of other reasons, do treat it that way. But in reality, the pie can always be made large enough. And we'll talk more about that later. So often for shorthand, I say in any conflict or discussion, any negotiation, make friends. Okay, you don't really have to like everyone and they don't have to like you, but you do need to get to know them. We work better with those with whom we're familiar. That's always the case. So at least build familiarity. Respect is also a bonus. Get to know the counterparts. It's important to see them as a person, to see them as a human being and see their humanity, even if you do not agree with their position, even if you have ideas in conflict. And especially actually, if you have ideas in conflict, it's important to see the counterpart as a human being. And this is because as human beings ourselves, We all make judgments about other people. Getting to know each other can overcome reactance. So when I was representing the United States, I would enter a room and people instantly had a perception of me based on their perception of the United States. Now that may or may not apply to me. Some of it probably did, other components did not. And if I got to know people, I could overcome that immediate reactance, that bias. I remember one woman with whom I used to work saying, "Oh, but you're the nice face of the US." That's not the best outcome. I optimally like her to want to work with all United States negotiators. However, she had gotten to know me and she could see me as a human being. And that's really important. Another colleague of mine in New York, how did I get muted?
Yeah.
Sorry, how much did you miss? That's very strange.
I don't know. You were muted just
for a second. We didn't
just
miss
for a
it.
second.
Okay, so strange.
Yeah, no.
Okay, we caught that. Thank you. Sorry, guys. So I used to be a DC-based negotiator, and one of my colleagues who was based in New York at the main United Nations headquarters wrote back to DC to me about a colleague he was working with who would not talk to the United States. She was from a country who is not a US ally. She did not like US diplomats, and she would not work with him. And so one weekend, he told me he planned a getaway at his grandmother's house. She lived right outside the city. And he invited this delegate who wouldn't speak to him and her partner and some other delegates and their partners from the group of 77 plus China developing countries. There's a block of developing countries that work together. He invited a number of them to come to his grandmother's house for the weekend at the beach. And the delegate who didn't like the US very reluctantly went. And she was really nervous about it, apparently, according to some other friends I spoke to. But she went with the other delegates and they spent the weekend. And when she got back, she reported, "Well, I still don't like the United States, but that Toby guy, I met his grandmother. She taught him some good lessons and I'll work with him." So he had built some familiarity. He built some common understanding. She came to see differently. The delegate who didn't like the US came to see Toby differently. She understood some of his values and she was willing to work with him. And they did. They worked very well together. And I have a number of similar stories myself. There was a woman that I used to try to work with, and she'd been in New York for a very long time. She was extremely experienced, over a decade already, and it was my first year. She was very theatrical. She used to bully a little bit to get her way, and I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. And I was afraid of her, and we spent 2 weeks negotiating something that should have taken 1 hour. And at the end, I was about to give up and I thought we could not reach agreement. And then she made kind of a nasty comment about me to her colleague in her language. And I heard her, I spoke her language. I happened to speak that language and I understood. And I responded to her, but jokingly. I took the nasty comment as a joke, responded in her language. And she said, "Wait, you speak my language?" And for the next 15 minutes, we negotiated in her language and we resolved the issue that had taken 2 weeks. So just having a little bit in common, having some point of familiarity, getting to know each other can make all the difference in any conflict situation. And I cannot underline the importance of this enough. It's something that I also overlooked for a long time. I didn't take these lessons to heart early enough because it can be very scary to enter a situation in which you need to argue for something or you're trying to achieve something. It's important to remember the humanity of the other side. Also, you're very, very likely to see these people again, whoever they are, even if you think you won't. And maintaining the relationship, building and maintaining that relationship, even in a conflict situation, has immense value. I could write a book about that alone. So I often say to people entering into a negotiation, don't fight for your interests, but work with partners to achieve them. So relationships is by far the most important key to a successful negotiation. The second key is interests. So really interests and motivations, because there's always more underlying the stated position of your counterpart than he or she says. And there's always more underlying the posture or behavior than you are aware of. So the interests under the positions and the motivations under the posturing are very, very important, both of them. Because of course, differences in perspective come from different underlying assumptions. So unless we understand these, we can't get to a solution. Linked to these, there are also the idea of agendas. Everybody has both sort of an official and a personal agenda. So maybe you and I are having a discussion over, I'm going to use this example later, where to go on vacation. I'm going to tell you what I want, but maybe underneath that, I have a personal agenda. Maybe I had a fight with my partner in the morning and I'm really upset and I'm kind of taking it out in this conversation. Maybe some other friends judged me for always going on vacation to the same place. And so I feel a little bit under pressure to choose a new place. And that's why I can't agree with you where we're going to go together. There can be a number of things at play. Maybe someone's having a bad day. Maybe something's going on with their family around the world. We never know what's happening with other individuals. And it's important to try to find out. I used to work with a guy who was a fantastic colleague, really smart, really creative. We worked brilliantly together when I used to travel to Nairobi often for work. And then he moved to New York. And when I would negotiate with him in New York, he was still very, very good, but he had a bigger portfolio in New York. He was responsible for more items and he couldn't come to all the meetings and negotiations he needed to cover. And I found that at a certain point in a negotiation, he would engage for the first couple meetings and then he would be unable to come, drop out, and come in at the end of the negotiation, right when the rest of us were going to reach agreement and say, no, I cannot agree to this. And I thought, well, why? Everything that you had said at the first couple of meetings actually has played out in this agreement we're about to agree. Everything you wanted is here. How can you not agree? What's going on? I finally realized that he did not feel sufficiently a part of the process. He was motivated by needing to have ownership over the outcome. And if he didn't feel a part of it, he couldn't support it. So I started taking him out for coffee, having lunch with him, catching him up on the negotiations he'd missed when he had a conflict with another meeting and couldn't be at the meeting for that negotiation. I tried to keep him up to date and he stopped destroying the agreement at the very end. And so it's important to understand both people's interests and where they're coming from. 80% of your time in a negotiation should be spent on the interests of the other side, divining them and discovering them, but also on your interests and understanding those, which is a hard thing to do. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So on interests, to sum it up, dig into the real interests behind the position, the motivations behind the posture, because this will help you to get you complete information, right? Complete information about the issue under discussion, the conflict under debate. And it will also help you to build trust, which is very important. So the third key to a successful negotiation is context. Okay, what does that mean? Well, often we call this preparedness when I teach about negotiations. It's important to be prepared. And I don't mean that you have to be an expert on the subject, be it you're having a negotiation about what the right thing to do financially for your family is, or you're having a conversation at the policy level about what the right environmental policy or regulation might be for your town water system. The context is important, regardless of the situation, because every conversation is going to have a history, right? It's probably not the first time you've had this conversation, whatever it might be, or this negotiation before. And the counterpart, it's probably not their first time thinking about it or talking about it either. So it's important to try to understand the history of this conversation. The precedent, has anything happened before on this item or issue between the two of you? Understanding the other personalities at play if it's a multi-party discussion or negotiation, right? So for example, maybe if you're an employee at a business and you feel like you've been working a lot of overtime, you've been putting in a lot of hours and your boss doesn't want to pay you for the overtime. When you go into that conversation, it's important for you to understand a little bit more about the context. Maybe the boss has been under pressure from the head of the company to not spend any more money. Maybe the boss shouldn't have been asking for overtime and has been getting in trouble for doing so. Maybe the boss paid overtime last year and found out he was getting cheated and therefore doesn't want to take the risk again. So it's important to have a larger view of the whole situation in order to be effective in a conversation. As large a view as possible. Again, complete information is not always possible, but you've got to try to get there. So sort of understanding the context in which you're engaging, knowing the system, if there is one, and how it works, the rules, the norms, the typical working methods, the typical manners of doing things, because these are all relevant. Also understanding, what else is happening in the world that might have an impact on the negotiation that you want to engage in. So substantive knowledge of the issue is really nice, especially for what I used to do, like a UN negotiation, but it's not as essential as institutional and contextual knowledge. Awareness of these things is really vital. I was just gonna check the chat before I continued. So the next lesson, the fourth lesson, is self-awareness. So what does this mean? I often tell negotiators to have a neutral mindset, right? And when I say a neutral mindset, I mean calm, open-minded, and the key one, self-aware. Why? So as you probably all already know, right? In any conversation, in any negotiation, emotion can lead to poor decision-making, right? Unless you're using that emotion, unless it's very real and controlled to kind of convey a point, emotion leads to poor decision-making. So we talked about, building relationships. We talked about understanding the interests of the other side. We talked about understanding the context, but it's also important to understand yourself. And that's where the self-awareness comes in, right? Understand your own interests and your own motivations. What are your real goals? Why are you trying to achieve this position you've described? Why are you behaving the way you are? What are your real motivations? Did you have a fight with your spouse and you're feeling under pressure and you're taking it out here? What is going on? Are you trying to impress your boss who's watching this negotiation? Are you trying to impress the counterpart? What are your motivations in this particular situation? And this is a hard thing to do. This is a hard thing to get a handle on, be aware of, and be honest about, right? Self-awareness also helps us to remain calm, to stay open to others' ideas, and to just listen, which is really essential in order to get to know the other side and hear their interests. This is also really hard, right? But self-awareness will help you to make better decisions and watch for opportunities for agreement. It will also help you to protect your credibility as a human being and as a negotiator, right? Being calm, being yourself, acting in good faith will help make you a reliable and valuable counterpart, someone that others want to work with. And so I often like to remind people engaging in a negotiation, again, a negotiation at any level, at the UN, at home, at work, that it's sometimes important to remember to take something we call the negotiator's pause. Why? Sometimes you need to be self-aware enough to know that you need to pause, take a step back, and review where you are and why you're doing what you're doing. It's very, very easy, especially when you're emotional about an issue under discussion, which is very, very often the case, to get caught up and lose sight of the bigger picture, lose sight of what you're actually trying to achieve and the relationships you're actually trying to maintain. There was one climate change negotiation in which one of the large countries, one of the large petroleum exporting countries had an outsized voice in the discussion, and their negotiator was quite a powerful presence and quite loud. And it was at a crucial point in the negotiation, and he got up and left the room. And we all thought that we were about to agree something on the issue that he'd been arguing all day long. We thought we were about to get there, but he got up and left. And so a colleague of mine went after him and said, why did you leave the discussion? Why have you left the conversation? This is the crux of the argument. This is the important point. We thought we were about to get somewhere. What's going on? And he said, I needed to take a break. I was getting too emotional about it, and I didn't want to make a bad decision. I didn't want to insist on too much, and I didn't want to give too early. I needed to step back and get some objectivity. And so that's an example of being self-aware enough to know you need a break. And this is okay in any conversation. So taking a break and just generally being self-aware also helps you to have a finger on the momentum, the timing, and the dynamics in the room so that you know when you and the other counterpart or counterparts are ready for agreement, right? When is trust built and when is everyone open to creativity and agreement? Self-awareness will also help you to share appropriate info when it's necessary to move forward, right? Hopefully complete info at a certain point, and also maintain trust. So that's the importance of self-awareness. And then finally, the fifth key to a successful negotiation is creative problem solving. So in many, many instances, when a problem seems particularly intractable, it seems like there's no mutually agreeable solution. Or as we used to like to joke at the UN, maybe there's no mutually disagreeable solution. But I would argue that actually, even with very difficult issues, in most cases, not all, some problems aren't solvable, but in most cases, to get past the intractable issue, you just need significant creativity. And this can often mean redefining what a good outcome looks like. We all go into a conversation or a negotiation with an idea of what the outcome should look like based on what we want. But once you've gotten to know the other side, understood their interests, understood the context, the outcome might look nothing like what you expected. And you might still get everything that you wanted. And that's okay. Actually, that's the perfect outcome, right? It might look nothing like what you imagined, but as long as you protected your core interests and maintained your bottom line, and you helped others to do the same, and everybody walks around from the table feeling like it was fair, that's okay, that's perfect. And creative problem solving helps to enlarge the pie. And those of you who do mediation and negotiation already know this, right? It's really, really essential. So I like to show this little graph when I talk about creative problem solving. And I often ask students, okay, if you have two negotiators, X and Y, and their positions are in this blue circles on each axis here, on the X-axis and the Y-axis. So their positions are at each extreme of those axes. Where should they come to agreement? This is a very simplistic mathematical model. So where should they come to agreement? And I won't ask you to answer this, but most people most often say right there in the middle, right there in the middle, and a compromise. But what if both X and Y could have everything they wanted? They could both be way out there and have so much more. And then what about all that lost space in between? So if you can come up with creative solutions, there are so many more options than just compromising or meeting in the middle, just bargaining and whittling away at each other in the middle. Come up with creative things where each party gets more. So that's why creative problem solving is so important, because you can help each other get more from what you want in any conversation and hopefully walk away from the table feeling better. Real life example for this one, I was trying to, so I asked my husband, what's a good example for creative options in a real life scenario? So not a UN scenario, but a real life one. And he said, oh, how about our own family vacation? I said, what do you mean? Okay, so in talking about our family vacation with our family, we have a 5-year-old daughter, we have my husband, we have me. And traveling is difficult with a 5-year-old, and with COVID, we didn't want to go very far. And right now we're living in Europe. So we'd already agreed we were going to stay in Europe, but I want a slow-paced, relaxed location where I can get some calm, sip pleasant, cool drinks, eat nice food, and minimize my stress. I'll explain what I meant by that in a minute, because my husband had to ask me. So I wanted, Corsica or the Greek islands or something like this. My husband likes cities. He likes to move around, walk, sightsee. He likes busyness and shopping. He doesn't care about pleasant drinks or the stress level particularly. He wanted to go to, Rome or Prague or Lisbon. And so after significant debate over this issue, he said, okay, well, what do you mean by minimizing stress? I said, oh, well, it's optimal if I could speak the language and communicate. I don't want to have to think about that. That's a stressful point for me. And especially with COVID and so I just want somewhere where it's a little bit more laid back and I can relax. He said, but I really want to see new stuff. And he said, wait a minute, haven't you been to Strasbourg before in France? I said, well, sure. Yeah, it's a lovely little calm place. It's very quiet. He said, you speak the language. Would that be stressful? I said, no, Strasbourg would be a lovely place. It's not stressful at all. How nice. We kind of walk around, sit at cafes. And he said, well, I've never seen it. There's beautiful architecture and museums and stuff for me to look at. I said, fantastic. So we ended up in Strasbourg, which had not been on the radar at all because I'd been there before, but who cares? That minimized my stress level. So it was actually quite perfect. And so that's just a silly example of what it means to create more options, right? Sometimes, in some cases, the best solution might be to delay. Maybe we should have just delayed the vacation if we couldn't come to agreement, if that's better for the relationship and better for the conflict. Or change the discussion, create more options, right? So it depends. It depends on what the real goals and interests of the counterparts are. Regardless, though, to sum up this lesson, the best outcome is very rarely a mere compromise, as I like to say. Of course, it's also an option. Okay, so I seem to have drawn on my screen for some reason. I don't know how. So just ignore the squiggly green lines. But I'll just wrap up the 5 key points, and then we'll touch on a couple other things, and we can open it up for questions. So these are the 5 lessons, really tips for successful negotiation, right? And they're all linked to each other. Build relationships, think interests, know the context, be self-aware, and engage in creative problem solving. And in my view, the best negotiations are, as I like to call it, problem solving with friends. Remember, I was a scientist and engineer. So problem solving with friends, a bunch of creative, open-minded engineers who optimally respect each other, or at least see the human in each other, sitting across from each other, trying to solve a problem. And so the best outcomes come from dynamics and processes that look like that, right? So if you can engage in that way, and hopefully help others to engage in that way, that's the tricky bit that we can deal with in some other webinar, helping others to engage in this manner, then you'll get to a better outcome. And there is strategy involved in this, right? It's linked to understanding the tone, the pace, and the timing that each party, even you, right? Even that you need to arrive at a place where you can open up and agree. So with that in mind, I've got a couple extra notes on these 5 things. All of these actions, as I said, are linked and they lead to each other, right? Building the relationship helps you understand the interests, helps you understand the broader context. And without self-awareness, you cannot get to the creative problem-solving piece. But all of these actions also build trust, right? They help build trust between parties, which is key to legitimacy. And finally, seeing people as human beings and recognizing their humanity, pursuing their interests with yours is kind of key to the principled interest-based negotiations that they talk about in the book, Getting to Yes. And I was going to show you a picture of the book, but of course I put it on the floor next to me. But there's a book I can show you at the end, Getting to Yes and Getting Past No, that really talk about a lot of the techniques to engage in principled interest-based negotiations. So what does all this mean for you in real life? Go slowly, think, maintain perspective to the extent possible. These are all really hard things, right? Don't get caught up by emotion. Remember the big picture. But also remember that there is very likely a creative solution that can meet the needs of both or all. So with that, I'm conscious of the time. I'll take just a few more minutes to talk about 2 more concepts before we wrap up. The first one is legitimacy. So in addition to those 5 lessons that I think it's really key for everybody to keep in mind when they are engaging in a negotiation type setting, there's this concept of legitimacy, which is very important for a successful outcome. And when I say successful, when I'm talking about an agreement or an outcome, I mean that it is accepted by the parties who engaged in it and are impacted by it, accepted, and that it is able to be implemented by them. So for me, that defines success. So for an outcome to be accepted, it has to be viewed as legitimate. And what does this mean? This is actually a very subjective thing. Basically, it means it needs to be viewed as fair. Did the process is the process that led to the outcome perceived as fair, right? Was communication transparent? Was it unbiased? Was there a hidden agenda or not? Hopefully not. Did each party get something and lose something, or did one party win? If it feels like one party won, then that's not going to feel like a legitimate process or outcome, right? That parties had a voice, that they were able to have a stake, a role, an ownership, express what they needed, that no one was bullied, no one was sidelined, basically a fair process, a fair discussion. And so if it doesn't feel fair to the participants or to those impacted, then the outcome resulting from that process is not going to be viewed as legitimate. And so basically, ultimately, legitimacy depends on the behavior and engagement of the counterparts in a negotiation, right? So it depends if you're negotiating one-on-one with somebody, legitimacy depends entirely on how you behave and how the other person behaves. If they bully you into an agreement, you're not going to feel like that was very fair, right? And to bring it back to the international level, on the international scene, the climate change negotiations have fallen victim to crises of legitimacy multiple times, right? Copenhagen in 2009, for my prime example, because I was there. Many family disputes fall victim to this. When the conversation or the outcome is viewed as unfair, it's not viewed as legitimate. So again, this matters because you're also likely to see the people again. And if people think things have been unfair, if your counterpart thinks it's been unfair, then it's just not going to fly. So from this perspective, it's also important not to be a bully in a negotiation. What does this mean? You know, bully, betray trust, force, insist. All of these things lead to poor outcomes, right? Because they shift the power dynamic, which is my next and last point. The power dynamics in a negotiation, there's always going to be a power imbalance, right? There is always going to be a power imbalance, but bullying, betraying trust, acting in bad faith, cheating, hiding information that really should be shared, all of these are tactics that shift the power dynamic in an unfair manner and that will make a negotiation process feel not legitimate, right? And it's essential to mitigate power imbalances. Some power imbalances we cannot control because power imbalances can emerge due to relative status, right? Which a counterpart may or not be aware of an imbalance in status. Some people are not aware of these things. And so that's a harder thing to counteract, but you can counteract them as the United States, as a speaker for the United States, which can have an outsized presence, which can be the quote, gorilla in the room, as we call it in our book. We talk about gorilla and ant delegates. That's why there's a picture of a gorilla here. I used to try to speak last, not speak first, not repeat myself too much, not pile on. If some other delegation had made an argument, I stayed quiet unless they needed my support. I tried to show that I wasn't going to dominate the conversation. And I felt like that was important to bring the power balance back so that everybody felt like they were engaging in a fair process. So it's essential to mitigate the status differences to the extent you can when you're aware of them. And it's also super important to just not be a bully, right? Remember, you're a human being, the other side is a human being, and nobody wants to be forced into anything. If you are negotiating with a bully, there are ways to counteract them. And the first gets back to that all important concept of relationships. Engage them, befriend them, or at least try to understand them. Make them feel heard and understood and included. And that will probably go a long way towards minimizing the bullying. If that doesn't work, you can always call out the tactic, point out what that tactic is and what it's doing to the process. Show them that they're being heard and seen in that way as well. And I don't recommend combating a bullying approach with a bullying approach unless it's an absolute last resort. I have resorted to that once or twice. I have one key story that I can remember right now, but I will not bore you with that unless there's time after the questions. But one story I will share is that one of the first times I went to New York for an extended period of time, one of my now co-authors found out it was my birthday while I was there. And I was there in New York alone. And she represented the developing countries at that point. I represented the US. I didn't know a lot of her and her colleagues yet. She threw a birthday party for me at her house, a dinner with the other delegates. You can bet I worked better with all of them after that, right? So just engaging a gorilla. So she engaged the delegation that had the power imbalance, right? And I was more likely to listen and collaborate. And I did, and we still do, as you see by our book and our ongoing collaborations. So that's just a little note on power dynamics. I have more stories about that, but power dynamics can also be impacted by theater. Like I talked about the delegate whose language I spoke, she was very theatrical because she felt like a smaller delegation who needed to shift the power dynamic in her direction. She was very theatrical in a negotiation, which was both good and bad. Controlled theater can help to signal to your counterpart how serious you are. But too much undermines your reputation and the legitimacy of the process because you think someone's faking. And that's ultimately what happened with her, with many other delegates that I used to work with. They thought she was just a fake and didn't really want to deal with her. So any theater's got to be strategic, and power dynamics should be mitigated to the extent possible, because maintaining the legitimacy of the process the conversation is key to a successful outcome. So with that, I will just tell you some closing thoughts. What I learned again and again and again in my multilateral negotiations, and then as I was thinking about it later in life, in my daily life, it's the individual and how the individual behaves that has a greater impact on any outcome to a conflict, a debate, a discussion, its content and its success than the various positions at play, right? Positions don't matter, but people did. And so the way that negotiators engage really determines the success of the outcome. So this is true in any negotiation. Did the party seek to build relationships or tear them down? Did she seek out the interests of others? Did he understand the context? Did she remain calm and open-minded? Did he engage and encourage creative problem solving? These activities directly impact the resolution of conflict and the solution to the problem. They determine the outcome. So the negotiator personally is the most important piece. So you as mediators, negotiators, and human beings, you have the power to set the tone. How you behave and engage impacts basically everything in the negotiations in which you engage. So this is a big responsibility, approaching the world, your interactions with a conflict resolution lens to help you speak and act for a better way to resolve conflict and for a better world. So with that, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'm happy to answer any questions you have now. Do we still have, we only have 11 minutes, but I'm happy to answer whatever there is. Andrea, is there much in the chat? I'm trying to get there, but my screen is.
Thank you, Rebecca. There are some questions in the chat. And first of all, thank you so much. It was so interesting. And I'm really looking forward to hear more of your examples, actually, in the masterclass. I mean, there we have more time. It will be 6 hours. And then, because I think the examples really help to get into the situation, to get a better feeling about what this was. There is one question Julia asked. It is about Christopher Voss' expertise, in particular with Black Swans Group, well known to you. Do you know that? If yes, how would you evaluate them in terms of efficiency? Furthermore, do you have any particular negotiation school in mind that you would consider your favorite?
So, okay, this is a great question. I have that book next on my reading list. I have not read it yet. I think
I have here.
Yeah, you have, right? We talked about this a little bit in our course, but I have not read it yet. So I can't really answer that question, but I can promise you, I'm hoping to have read the book by the time we do the masterclass, and then I'll be able to speak to that. I think, I mean, colleagues have talked about his approach as being maybe a little bit jaded occasionally, but quite astute in terms of solving problems. I don't know, Andrea, what you think.
Yeah, I think, you know, that it is never split the difference, and also only to get everybody in the context of it. It is an author who was an FBI negotiator for hostage problems. So he, very difficult situations that he was in. And there are some techniques, but I would say that the way of his negotiation is a little bit more manipulative. And of course, in this situation, this is also needed. What Rebecca was telling about, it's more about the future orientation of it. So it is, we negotiate, but we also want to have sustainable results for the future. And that is, of course, not the case with hostage negotiation. You want the result immediately, and afterwards you don't want to hopefully negotiate ever again. And this is the big difference, I would say.
That's perfect. Thank you, Andrea. So school, I got surprisingly I got some training, but very little training in terms of school. No, but I will say that I think, you can't see them. This book first, I'll hold it right in front of my face. Getting to Yes, by Fisher, Yuri and Fisher and Yuri is essential. And then this one, a follow-up, I like this because it helps talk about how to bring others to the table to the same mindset. And I think it's really useful. So those I would recommend. Absolutely.
So there are other questions.
How to manage conflict of interest?
Yes.
Ooh, well, that's always tough. And I'll be honest with you, in the negotiations at the UN, there's almost always a conflict of interest. And in our personal negotiations, there's almost always a conflict of interest. How do you manage that? as individuals, I would urge us to be conscious of it ourselves and to try to engage with the other side about it to the extent possible. We cannot always avoid it, unfortunately. But that, again, it requires two parties that are willing to do that.
We have another question about how can one move forward in negotiations if the other party is set in their ways and refuses to budget? Maybe just because that is a topic on its
It's an entire webinar.
It's an entire webinar. It's about how to overcome deadlocks. And actually, we're going to have this webinar soon with Rebecca. So maybe you want, if you're interested in that, just enroll in our information. Alex have already sent the links, because we have a next free webinar about this. How to overcome deadlocks in negotiation. I think, there is a long question to
Absolutely right. And again, if you want to read a book, this book is very helpful with that in mind. Does trying to control the pace and tone of negotiation will not be viewed as bullying? That is an excellent question. And this takes a lot of tact. You are not trying to control the pace and tone. You are trying to set a positive tone, I think is what I was going for, right? You're trying to set a tone of cooperation and engagement. Now, as you try to set a tone of cooperation and engagement, you cannot bully people into cooperating and engaging positively. But I would argue that with doing, it's from the perspective that you do those that matters, right? You can't, So it's a little bit different. It is a little bit nuanced, though. If you do try to control the pace and tone, if you try to set, a business-like tone and the other party needs it to be slower, then that it will be viewed as bullying. Absolutely. If you try to speed up the pace because you see the agreement, but the other party isn't there yet and needs more time to process, needs more time to express, then that will also be viewed as bullying. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's about more engaging in cooperation and setting the tone through your example, more what I'm talking about than absolutely controlling it, if that makes sense. I may not have expressed that as clearly as I hoped.
Yeah, thank you. Wendy asked, are people generally teaching this approach throughout the world?
Yes and no. Mm-hmm. So, for example, as a diplomat, I did receive a week-long training course in negotiations, and we used Getting to Yes. And Getting to Yes, this book does talk about principled interest-based negotiations and why engaging in that way leads to better outcomes. So it is taught. This is not how generally, however, I experience diplomats engaging, because when you show up to any discussion in which there's going to be a conflict, it is quite intimidating. And I know that for my first year or two, I showed up with this list of instructions and things I thought I had to achieve. And clearly I had to fight for this. And so as human beings, because we're insecure, because we're nervous and scared, we show up sort of fighting. And it takes experience and it takes self-awareness to say, take a deep breath and instead engage. But I will tell you, really, really 100%, the best outcomes I had were from people collaborating around a table. They might have to sit at the microphone and say the words that sound like fighting because they are showing their audience at home or the audience watching that they are a powerful country and they're important about the face-saving component of it, sure. But the best outcomes come from actual person-to-person collaboration beneath that posturing, beneath the face-saving bit. Because again, when you're engaging as human beings, you understand each side needs a little bit of face-saving, you kind of let them have it, if that makes sense. But yeah, people are teaching this approach. I just think it's very hard to practice because we are all human. And I didn't always, I will be the first to tell you, it took me years and years and years to really, truly get it. And I was not as practiced as I wish I had been for a very long time.
There is a question about the story you told, Rebecca, about the person leaving the room after a heated up monologue. Yeah. Couldn't it also be a tactical move of his or her in order to make the counterpart more accessible to compromises? Like a manipulation?
Yes. In fact, one of the story I was about to tell about myself that I didn't want to, because we're running out of time, is about precisely this. Absolutely. So I was engaging in a negotiation once for weeks on end over a silly small point that we should have resolved immediately. And slowly over time, the other delegate was whittling away at all of my positions. So I was so far from where I thought we needed to be by this 2-week point in. I decided, this guy is crazy. He said he could agree at the beginning and then came back and changed his mind. And that happened progressively. So I pounded my fist on the table and I got up and walked out of the room, because at that point, I decided I didn't care what happened. And I have to tell you, 5 minutes later, he called me and agreed to everything from 2 weeks earlier, right? Everything that he'd whittled away. So yes, absolutely. And I learned the hard way by actually doing this myself, that it is and can be a tactic which I should argue, I will say, should not be used except very carefully. In this particular case, the other delegate, the case that I did this, the other delegate was not taking me seriously and was trying to sort of, I hesitate to use the word cheat, was trying to kind of trick me into giving away more than was actually fair. And I didn't realize it. And I didn't realize it for a long time. But the theatrics of my response snapped him into understanding the seriousness of where he pushed me. And so that's what I was talking about when theater can be used to your benefit, to convey how important something is, but should not be used lightly. Because if I were to do that in every negotiation, people would say, oh, she does that all the time. It doesn't mean anything. But yes, it can be a signal if used appropriately, or it can be a power rebalancing tactic as used by that other negotiator who I talked about, who was trying to rebalance power. But again, if you overuse, you're not taken seriously as a counterpart, because people will assume you're pretending it. But yeah, absolutely. To try to make somebody more, because that is a form of manipulation too, to use a tactic like that to try to make someone more accessible to compromises. Hopefully it's only used when the outcome is actually fair and not to coerce.
Rebecca, there is one last question. Would you mind to answer it,
Sure.
even though we are like 1 hour after our beginning? It is, how do you use principles in negotiations with striking cross-cultural differences?
So
it's a seminar on its own, right?
That is also a seminar on its own. This is an excellent question. Thank you all for such thoughtful questions. I really appreciate these today. Yeah. So this manner of engagement that I've talked about today is appropriate, I think, across cultures. However, the manner that you adopt, I believe, should depend on the cultures involved. So your actual manner of engagement and approach and how you talk to the other parties is most effective if you alter it to be culturally appropriate, if that makes sense. Now, that said, there were some cultural hurdles to overcome. And this is why I like to talk about negotiation from this perspective, because we did have some of the negotiating style differences came indeed from cultural differences. Sometimes I worked with delegates who were men from certain countries who did not want to be working with a woman from my country. The way to deal with that, well, actually, we have a chapter in our book about that. The way to deal with that, we have a chapter in our book about that. But the way to deal with that is to continue to engage and try to build the relationship anyway. I had to just let slide off a lot of comments that maybe could have been viewed as borderline offensive. And I'm sure some other delegates felt like maybe I was approaching them too casually, right? So I had to learn a lot about how other cultures engage and try to be more formal when that was appropriate, less formal when it wasn't. It's a give and take a little bit. So as delegates at the UN, we all knew we needed to do that. In real life situations, it might not be as obvious to the counterparts. So again, this is where your self-awareness comes in. Try to think, just be aware of the cultural differences. And I think this approach always works as long as you attune your style, if that makes sense. But yeah, this is another webinar. That's a whole other webinar.
Yeah, and I would also add to this with the cultural differences. I think it's actually good to practice in groups like this, where we are together from all over the world to really listen to each other. What kind of question? How is it phrased? How can I respond to this? This is, I think, the great thing about having trainings in intercultural groups, because sometimes we are not even aware, and then we being the person we are, and then but listening to others can really raise our awareness to the differences and also to the reactions then. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody from all over the world, to join this this webinar, to ask all these very valuable questions. And of course, thank you so much, Rebecca, for this interesting webinar, for this insights in your work practice, and also like the theory that you combined with it, together with the examples you gave. We really thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for your participation and your questions. I really appreciated it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a nice day, evening, night, morning, whatever.